Ladies and gentlemen, I had the honor of preparing the edition of Hayek's Law, Legislation and Liberty for his collected works, which was published last year. There is a huge amount of interesting material in the book, of which I can today highlight only 3 themes. The first is the theme of law, legislation, and liberty itself. On this, Hayek had, in a letter to the Italian scholar Bruno Leone, said that he would write a pamphlet in response to Leone's work. Hayek, in his Road to Serfdom, had been concerned with what seemed to him the bad consequences that would follow from the pursuit of then fashionable ideas about economic planning. By this was meant not the replacement of a market economy by a planned economy. His concern was with ideas about superimposing governmental direction of the economy onto a market-based system. His concern was with the consequences that this would have if pursued systematically for personal liberty and also for the misdirection of the economy. Critical responses to Hayek, including from Keynes, had raised the problem, but given that Hayek himself favored various kinds of governmental action, including a version of the welfare state, how did his own proposals avoid placing him on the road to serfdom? Hayek's response to this, set out in unpublished material subsequent to the road to serfdom, and then in his Constitution of Liberty, was that the threat to liberty could be overcome if government itself was subject to the rule of law in a strong sense. Hayek's understanding of the rule of law was distinctive, as he was influenced by the German, initially Kantian Rechtsstaat tradition. This took up a theme which one finds, for example, in Rousseau's Social Contract, in which law has first to be completely universal in its character, and second, to apply to government as well as to private citizens. What was distinctive about law, legislation, and liberty was that Hayek, under the impact of an argument that Leone made in his Freedom and the Law, argued that a common law understanding of the law would offer a greater promise of stability in the law than would the constant activities of legislative bodies. A key theme of law, legislation, and liberty was then a reinterpretation of his understanding of the rule of law in terms of an idealized account of the Anglo-American common law tradition. This seems to me a most interesting project for research, not least as the Rechtsstaat tradition had historically been understood in terms of codifications of the law undertaken by legislative bodies rather than in terms of common law. A second theme in Law, Legislation and Liberty was Hayek's critique of the idea of social justice This seems to me a most important and interesting piece of work, not least because of the ubiquity of the idea and its invocation on almost every side in contemporary politics by people who simply fail to address the issues that Hayek raises. However, the situation is a little more complex than it might seem, just because, as I've already indicated, Hayek does not himself reject the idea of a welfare state. Indeed, from the road to serfdom onwards, and in contradistinction from many libertarians and classical liberals, he tried to work out how governmental action, which went beyond a minimal state, could be compatible with freedom and a well-functioning market economy. One consequence of all this is that Hayek's critique of social justice reads in many respects like an updating and generalization of earlier critiques of just price theory. That's to say, he stresses the problems of what just rewards would be in a market economy and the problems of trying to superimpose government-mandated prices onto a price system. But Hayek, I think, leaves us with problems about the kind of extra market welfare state that he's willing to support. That's to say, just who should be receiving what from whom. There is again a lot of interesting work for people to undertake who wish to follow in Hayek's footsteps. My third theme relates to his ideas about a second chamber of a democratic system, which would set the general rules within which the ordinary business of government would be conducted. The idea of doing this in some ways goes back to the Republican tradition and is again to be found in Rousseau's social contract. But Hayek strengthens the argument for this with an analysis of the problems of interest group politics. He here draws on the work of Mancur Olson, whose logic of collective action he had his seminar at Freiburg translate into German. Hayek in Law, Legislation and Liberty made an interesting case for such a second chamber. However, he then in some ways diminished the impact of his argument by offering a specific idea about how it might operate. This was on the basis of election of representatives to a second chamber by age-based cohorts of the population, starting when people are 40. This speculative idea attracted a lot of attention and criticism to the detriment of consideration of his ideas on this theme as a whole. Hayek's book is large and full of interesting and stimulating ideas. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you, which has been an honor.